All right, welcome to A Growing Concern. You can probably say it a lot better than I do, but it just seems to me that these free trade agreements are going to guarantee that we keep going down the fossil fuel road.
Well, yes, that is exactly right. And particularly the Trans-Pacific Partnership does that more than other than the previous agreements have. But the previous agreements have done this also, and in particular, the best example of it is the decision that Obama made to stop the Keystone Pipeline from being developed, and then the suit from the Canadian manufacturer TransCanada, or developer TransCanada, sued the United States for $15 billion for expected future profits loss. That's what they thought they could have made from this pipeline had it been completed. And so they sued the United States. So now we don't know how the suit hasn't been decided. It was just filed earlier this year.
Pretty much
and
always
they usually take they usually take a number of years before they're settled. But the United States government should not have to defend itself against such a suit, because these agreements empower multinational corporations over national corporations, and they empower multinational corporations over our national governments, and ultimately over our state governments and our local governments, because as these agreements go into effect, then state governments and local governments start looking over their shoulders and say, should we do this? If we do this, will we be sued? Can we afford to defend ourselves? Or would the United States federal government defend us if we do this? And so you start having this damping down of the whole democratic process that we should be empowering, and instead these trade agreements destroy those processes.
Well, I know that's happened. Like I think that was Bolivia or one of the South American country where they I think it had to do with water. They booted a company out because it was going to be dangerous to their environmental standards, and they got sued. And the company that was sued them went to the WTO with hundreds of lawyers, and they had a few. And they end up getting this big suit against them and lose. And the United States, we have, if we get sued, at least we can put up a fight. And there shouldn't be any reason why we would be beholden to a corporation. In the rundown from the WTO battles up there, I think that came out that the first 6, I think, or 5 or 6 economies or countries, and then you start getting into corporations after that. You remember what that was?
Yes, I remember all those big circles and
I know California thinks it's the 6th, and we start getting into states, and then we start getting into corporations.
Yeah. Well, I think at this point you probably that probably has accelerated. So the largest ones are probably now multinational corporations with national governments. Probably not the United States, probably not China, but most national governments being smaller. So it's a dangerous road that we've gone down, and we've gone down it rather blindly in most cases, and without a whole lot of discussion. And there has been, for instance, talking about the WTO. Back in probably 1999 or 2000, the WTO was having their convention in Seattle, and thousands and thousands of people went to Seattle to protest the WTO.
I was there. You probably were there.
I wasn't there, but I watched it on TV.
You watched the battle. You didn't watch.
I didn't watch the WTO proceedings because they were all private, but we watched the battle, and so there was a lot of discussion. But that was really an awakening for a lot of Americans, particularly about what was happening in their name. And since then, we've had a whole lot of other agreements, not as large as the WTO, because they decided that the WTO approach of doing these big global agreements wasn't going to work because of the tremendous amount of opposition that they draw. So the United States and others started doing smaller regional or just bilateral agreements. So the United States now has 21 nations that we have agreements with. Again, these agreements establish the rights of corporations and multinational corporations in particular to overturn our rules and our regulations if those corporations think that their future profits have been diminished.
I know that I think in rundown there was a few more big meetings having to do with fair trade or free trade, and there was a big one in Florida at the FFTA, I think is what it was,
right.
And that was a whole chunk of countries that were supposed to join this FFTA, and they got stopped.
Yeah.
But then they just got one from Panama, then they got one from here, and they got one from Colombia, and they just started doing them one at a time, like you say.
Right. Yeah.
And I think, of course, this is a different situation. But then Korea signed one, and that reminds me, we were talking about this TPP, like everybody knows what it is.
Yeah.
And a lot of them probably do, but unfortunately, if people knew more about what this was and what it entailed, there may be more outrage. So it's basically just a ring of fire countries. Others can sign on to it, though.
Yeah. So it's including the United States. There's 12 nations that are part of this Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it was negotiated in secret for 7 years by the Obama administration. So it most definitely is his baby, and you want to talk about this. I quite frequently have people asking us, like, why would he support this? And it's not that he supports it; he's responsible for writing it. So of course, yes, he supports it.
You support your own children, don't you?
You support your own children.
Yeah.
Yes, right. Yeah, and so 7 years of secret negotiations. There was approximately 700 corporate lobbyists that got to sit at the table, negotiate it, write it. Sometimes the lobbyists themselves actually wrote particular sections of it.
But no environmentalists and no labor.
Well, there were a few.
A few.
So if you look at that list of 700, you'll see a few labor organizations and a few environmental organizations, but their role was very, very limited. They only got to look at the one chapter on labor and the one chapter on the environment and made comments on it, and then they were excluded from the conversation entirely. So the conversation continued for years with no involvement on the part of labor or environmentalists until the very end. And so this agreement was then signed by President Obama and will be presented to Congress when President Obama decides that he's got the votes to pass it. And we do expect that he will do that during the lame duck session after the November election. So right now, the push is to get as many people as possible to call their representatives, in particular their representatives, senators also, but representatives first, because that's where we really think that we can defeat this.
Because most of the Oregon delegation is for it.
Unfortunately, most of the Oregon delegation is for it, and so you have Greg Walden in Eastern Oregon. Of course, he's a Republican. He is in favor of it. Earl Blumenauer, who I am running against, Bonamici, whose first name escapes me at the moment, Suzanne Bonamici, and Kurt Schrader have made statements which would suggest that they're in favor, but what they're officially saying is they haven't made up their minds yet. But this is in spite of the fact that, as far as I know, all of the leadership in the House, Democratic leadership, and all the Democratic leadership in the Senate have all come out opposed to the Trans-Pacific Partnership now. Earl Blumenauer indicates that he's still studying and still listening. But we had a meeting with him a few weeks ago. There was environmental groups at the meeting, and Earl gave us an hour to talk and
To listen.
to listen, mostly to listen to him, and we all came away from the meeting with the most definite feeling that he plans on voting for the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I will say that his voting record on all of these agreements since he got into Congress has been about 75% in favor. So early on, there were some agreements that he opposed the early fast track authority, which was enacted, but he opposed that. And then there was an agreement with Oman, and he opposed that. And then CAFTA, the Central America Free Trade Agreement, which was another big regional one, he opposed that one also. And
what distinction is there between them? I mean,
well,
they all have very similar
yes,
principles.
Yes, they do. And I have not gone back and tried to find statements from him as to explaining why he voted, and I just don't have that much memory to remember back.
Mm-hmm.
But it is in the record that he did vote no. He also did vote no on the Colombia Agreement, which was the more recent. So President Bush negotiated 4 agreements. One with Panama, one with Peru, one with Colombia, and one with South Korea. They were all approved. The Peru agreement was approved while President Bush was still president. The other 3 were put into Obama's pocket, and Obama presented them to Congress, and they were all 3 approved as well.
Well, I can remember that there was a million people in the street against it in South Korea.
Oh yes,
and it's similar in Peru or someplace in South America.
Yeah. There's been
those people didn't want it either.
The agreements with these countries usually engender a lot of local opposition. It's just in the United States where we're totally dominated by this corporate media that we don't have these conversations and people don't understand what's going on. South Korea agreement, which Representative Earl Blumenauer supported, has now been in effect for 4 years. And Obama, in promoting it, said that it would cause our trade deficit with South Korea to go down, and that it would create American jobs, particularly in the auto industry, and that it would just generally be a really good thing. And so what's actually happened in that 4-year period of time is that our trade deficit with South Korea has doubled. Mm-hmm. And the amount of cars being exchanged between the 2 countries is all of the Korean cars being imported and almost no American cars being exported. So that means no jobs being created in the United States.
Except for this, I think Toyota has a factory here, and there's some factories that have come over here that are building them here.
Yes, but that has nothing to do with the exports and the imports.
Right. Of course not.
And of course Toyota is a Japanese company, so.
Right. But maybe Hyundai might have one here too. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's aside from the issue of trade, though.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we talked a lot about how this works, and you had a piece of paper here that just goes to show you exactly what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Not only does it tries to force this this fossil fuel industry down our throat, but at the same time it is also seriously discouraging alternative ways, like with India.
Yes, yeah. So the WTO.
World Trade Organization.
The World Trade Organization, right? Yeah, is the kind of the granddaddy of all of these agreements.
2 black eyes, but still,
but they're still going.
Yeah.
So the most recent agreement, and this was just announced yesterday, I believe, or most recent decision from the WTO was that India was in violation of the most favored nation clauses of the WTO, which says that all of the WTO nations must be treated, and the companies within them must be treated the same. So in India's case, they had a law which promoted renewable solar energy, and they were actually quite successful at it. And one of the aspects that the United States objected to was that they required a certain percentage of the production of the solar to be done in India. So it was a buy local clause. And the United States sued India because of that. And so there was a decision, I think in January, against India, and then an appeal, and just in the last couple of days the WTO ruled again, and again they ruled against India. The interesting thing about this, one of the going way back, one of the reasons for doing the WTO and many of these other agreements was to stop trade wars, which are seen as being a basic cause of war.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we see now with this decision in India is the beginning of a new trade war, but fought in a different venue, because now India has sued in the WTO, has sued the United States for exactly the same thing, saying that 8 of our states have renewable energy, solar energy promotion programs that have requirements for buying local. And so now we've got this back and forth between the United States and India, and we all are going to be harmed by this, because the one of the ways we sell these programs, at least in the United States, is that they create jobs here.
Local jobs.
Right, yeah. And if we can't have buy local requirements, then that incentive to do these programs disappears.
To do this, just for people to invest in locally in sustainable energy, like making photocells or whatever.
Right.
Because
exactly.
these things are just incredible. I've seen something the other day where they got them now that these wind machines that don't even have fans anymore.
Mm-hmm.
They just rock like this.
Oh, yeah.
And they get energy from that.
Yeah.
So we need to have that technology and that R&R, research and development, or R&D. We need to have that. Put out there, not to be discouraged.
Yeah. So from this report that I got, the states that have programs that will be challenged are California, which has a rebate program, Washington State, which encourages small-scale renewable energy production with incentives for solar and wind components made in the state of Washington. Minnesota, very, very similar kind of thing. Connecticut, Michigan, Delaware, and thought that there were some more. But anyway, with Washington State and California being very large states, we've got a lot on the line here.
Mm-hmm.
And a question about whether these programs, which are in part designed to fulfill our obligations and India's obligation to the Paris Climate Agreement, now in jeopardy. And the WTO, I'm sorry to keep going on.
No, please.
The WTO, and these other agreements, these cases are taken to 3 judge private tribunals that make the decisions, and they don't make decisions based on anything except trade rules. So they don't look at the reason why there might be buy local requirements in the regulations or the laws. Their only concern is, did we treat the American companies the same as we treated the Indian companies? That's the only thing they can decide on.
To me, it just seems like it is discouraging, green industries and supplanting the green industries with greenback industries.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about the bucks. I mean, you talk about the trade, but all the money majority of the money that's being made is going to be going up to the top, and if local economies aren't going to have the boon of in this particular case the sustainable energy development, and this is probably going to be the same in other areas, industries as well.
Yes.
We're shooting ourselves in the foot.
Oh yeah, oh absolutely.
And we have been doing all along, like with NAFTA even.
Yeah, and then specifically with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there's actually a clause in the Trans-Pacific Partnership that says that specifically that LNG, liquefied natural gas, will not be subject to national review, that those terminals will automatically, if somebody wants to invest to build one, those will move forward without any of the environmental or other considerations, review processes that we typically currently have. And those processes have slowed those terminals down in the United States, in Oregon. But those will be tossed out the window if the WTO, or excuse me, if the TPP is actually enacted.
I think Dick Cheney did the same thing when he was vice president, having to do with fracking.
Yes, I recall.
He did something that made that.
He preempted
it.
some of the states' abilities to regulate fracking in particular. Right.
I don't know. They want to put
so that this is talking about. We have this problem locally about local laws being preempted by state laws, and I think right now in Oregon, in Portland, where we're talking about possible rent control, but we don't really get to discuss that because the state has said no. The only rent control laws that could be passed would have to be passed at the state level. You, the city, cannot do this. And then we have the same thing happening with the federal government preempting local state laws. And now we have these international trade agreements doing the same thing with federal governments. So that decisions on the part of the federal governments or the states or the local governments can then be challenged in these private trade tribunals, and the tribunals are made up of corporate lawyers.
Well paid.
Well paid. Yes. And there's there's actually now a like a hedge. That's not the right word. I'm sorry. A betting schemes. Take me back to 2008 and the downfall of Wall Street.
Yeah, right.
And Wall Street was betting that their loans would fail, and then they were actually making their money on the bet rather than on the loan.
Yeah, that's terrible.
And so there's actually this industry is now developing around these trade agreements with lawyers advising corporations how they can use the agreements to challenge our laws and regulations. And then there's another industry developing which is betting on who's going to be successful. And so the whole thing is really totally disgusting. I wish we had a Jesus Christ and could just throw all of these money lenders out of the temple.
Well, we know what would happen to him if he did.
Yes, right. Yeah.
We've got some precedent on that.
And we do have some people that are trying to do that. I think of Elizabeth Warren.
Well, just exactly who came to my mind. And Bernie.
And Bernie Sanders, right? Yeah.
Before we get into some phone calls, there's been three things I thought to mention and forgot it. But one thing I do remember is, I forget what it was, but just a small percentage of that 7,000 or whatever pages of this TPP, I forget how many, 3,000?
5,500.
Like 7% of it has to do with trade?
Yes, right. Typically trade is talking about tariffs and quotas. And there's very, very little of that. In fact, within most of these countries that we're talking about, we've already removed most of those things. So there's very little in there about that. So really, in order to call this it shouldn't be called a trade agreement. It shouldn't be treated as a trade agreement. It should really be treated as a treaty. But then if you treat it as a treaty, then there are different requirements in terms of approval. And that's why these agreements have always been regarded as agreements and not treaties. Because with a treaty, then you have to have 2/3 of the Senate to approve.
It never happened.
And it will never happen.
Well, what it is to me, it's a corporate hegemony opportunist bill or whatever, because it's basically just ensnaring the people of the earth and enshrining the corporate, the corporate way of doing things, and all the money is going to go to the top, and and NAFTA was 1.2 million. Mexicans ended up having to leave their farms and go to the cities, and it really hurt a lot of the textile industries in Ohio and different places, and I believe that's what it was. It's been a while since I've thought about that, and this is going to be the same thing, and probably worse. NAFTA on steroids. Well, the damage is going to be on steroids too.
Yes.
And I'm glad to see that you're running up against Earl. Even though I think he's on board with a lot of great things, this is a deal killer to me as far as his ability to govern.
Yes, it really is, and I agree with you. There's so many things that Earl does that I do like, but this one is such a uber issue. It is over every other issue.
It connects up with every issue.
It connects up with almost every other issue you want to bring up. Immigration is one. And we know that with NAFTA, which Earl wasn't in Congress at the time, so he didn't vote for or against it. But with NAFTA, we know that President Clinton, when he was promoting it, said, this is going to cut down on immigration from Mexico, because this is going to help the Mexican economy so much they're not going to want to come here. Well, that was totally wrong. Totally, absolutely the opposite happened. The immigrants just started pouring over the border because they got kicked off of their lands, and they couldn't make a living from doing the agricultural.
And they sent a lot of the money home. Let's open up the phones here. We can talk about, continue on if somebody wants to call in. I meant to get this done earlier, but it's been a fascinating conversation. And we've done a lot of programs on fair trade or free trade, and it should be fair trade. It should be good for the people, not just the elitists is a good word to me. And I think those 600 corporate lawyers, or however many you mentioned, they are elitists. They don't go home and worry about how they're going to pay their rent, or worry about if somebody gets sick and they're going to be on the street. They're not down here with folks. And hopefully we've got some folks that be interested in commenting or calling in and ask some questions.
So all of these agreements are very much elitist kind of agreements, and one of the things we just called for was doing it democratically. Open the negotiations up so that we can see what's being done. 7 years of secret negotiations. Even our Congress people and our senators, for most of that time, were not able to see it.
And weren't allowed to take notes when they did.
Exactly. And when they were able to, they couldn't talk about it. They were still sworn to secrecy. So this whole process has been so undemocratic from the secrecy. One of the things that democracy works well, or one of the reasons why democracy works, is when it's transparent. And there's nothing about this process that's been transparent.
Well, I see we got the phone number up there. Hopefully folks want to, if not, that's cool too, because there's a lot to talk about. But we got, 8 minutes, and I just don't know where to go to from here. Do you have any particular direction? I know I did a show on this a while back, and there was a young man that came on to talk about, we do have a phone call. We might hold on to that. First caller, you're on the air. First call is always bumpy.
Okay, I got to mute my television because she didn't tell me I was going on the air. Stand by.
All right. We hear you.
Audio just really. Okay.
All right, you're on.
No.
We hear you.
Okay.
You're on the air.
You have a major problem there at PCM TV, which is there's basically no audio to us people out here in eastern Washington County, I'm only about a quarter mile away from the city limits of Portland, and this has been an ongoing problem for the last, at least 3 or 4 years.
Longer than that,
I know
man.
that it's originating from your facility down there, because when I watched conversations with Dr. Don the other day, the audio was just perfectly fine. But on this show, basically anything that comes out of Portland Community Media, Metro East Community Media, or even Willamette Falls Media Center, where you have the, what is it called, Progressive Radio on TV, where they have it on the first Tuesday of the month, there's almost no audio. What I've got to do is basically plug in a set of headphones to my small TV and turn the volume up all the way, and then I can just barely hear you. But somebody down there, my suspicion is, well, it doesn't take a genius to figure this out, is sabotaging your community media outlet. And I watched C-SPAN for years. I watched the Republicans and some of the Democrats put forward legislation to try and get rid of local cable access.
Oh,
they don't want people like you or David Delk or Dr. Don or Paul Stanford telling what the world is really like. They want to shut you up.
All right.
The other thing is that's really messed up, besides the lack of audio, and what little audio it is kind of garbled. I mean, it's kind of like distorted. And then on top of it, it says Friday only, questions or comments. On that particular graphic that's on the screen right now, it has to have the date in big, legible numbers, because now and then your show gets replayed on a Friday, and a little moniker that he puts up there, or he or she, or whoever is your graphic artist, that they put their little moniker up there for the date over in the corner. They don't put it up at the same time that you say Friday only with the phone number, and even if they did, it's unlegible. I've got to hold a magnifying glass actually up to the damn screen to see what the date is. So
I appreciate all the information. We have other callers coming in behind you there, but I appreciate that. We'll work on that. What do you knew about that audio situation? It's been going on for longer than 3 or 4 years, and it's at Comcast. It's obviously if it's at
I know, and I can figure that out.
If it's at the different facilities, then it ain't us.
Yeah,
it's Comcast.
Uh-huh.
So I think we had another caller. I don't know if that's the case or not. I did see the lights flash. So we're down to almost a little over 4 minutes. But he brought up a good point. I mean, I think that graphic's fine. A date wouldn't hurt, because like he says, we didn't have a show last week. So at that point, they might have tried to call and it wouldn't have been one. But during the program, I think we have the date. The time, a date, I mean, but I guess it's too small, so we'll have to work on that. And I appreciate the information, because we've got a lot to learn. Are you there, caller?
This is a different caller.
All right, yeah, we got about a couple of minutes for a call here. You have any comments or questions?
Well, you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and chime in on the Channel 11 audio thing, and to the caller that was just before me. It's not a PCM thing. If you're getting it on whether it's Willamette Falls or Tualatin Valley or PCM or Metro East, that means it's a Channel 11 thing, the CAN network.
That's right. That's right.
CAN network, and it's a Comcast thing. And now, just to make sure that the caller understands where I'm going with this, I live in Gresham. The program just prior to this came from TVC TV. And it was really, really low audio. I had my TV all the way up. I could still barely hear it. When it transitioned from that program to this program, I had to turn my TV down, about blew the speakers off.
I'll be darned.
And now I'm in Gresham, a different head end, a different Comcast head end where that caller was from. And it's something with the CAN network. And if it can be addressed, if that caller still has serious issues. Well, actually, I'm sorry about this. If he's with MAC, if he's on the west side, he has to deal with the Metropolitan Area Communications Commission. Out here in this area, we deal with MHCRC, Mount Hood Cable Regulatory Commission.
All right.
I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you for the call. We have another caller. We'd like to get this back onto the track that we were on. David's candidacy here. We haven't discussed that, but
Yeah.
the graphics have been going up, so they know
okay,
what's
great.
going on.
All right,
so,
great. Yeah.
And
So,
we get this next caller, but you are running as a candidacy to against Blumenauer.
yes, right. Yeah. So Earl Blumenauer is, like I said earlier, almost 75% record for voting in favor of free trade agreements, or corporate trade agreements, actually, as I prefer to call them. He has not said how he will vote on the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We do know that not too long ago, a year ago, he was one of only 13 Democrats that voted in favor of the Fast Track Authority that allowed the president to sign it and then hold it into his pocket until he's ready to present it to Congress. So,
well, let's hope that a formidable opponent will make him think twice about it.
Yeah, so I'm hoping that our viewers will go to my website, which is www.daviddelk.org, and sign the endorsement form. I'd love to have your names on the
which I have already done.
Okay, great. And then I have, if you're on Facebook, go to my Facebook page, which is Friends of David Delk, and like it, and most importantly, share it with all of your Facebook friends.
I've done that.
So that's the really important part of the Facebook, is sharing it with your friends. So that's how we're really going to spread this word that Earl Blumenauer has somebody who is running specifically to say no to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I am
and yes to fair trade.
Yes. And I am running as a candidate for the Oregon Progressive Party.
Right, and hopefully maybe the Working Families Party will come in behind you as well. So
yes, yeah.
We're down to 30 seconds. I want to thank the crew, giving us the good work that they've done, and this is highly technical sometimes, and also the phone call.